Perhaps you felt that something is wrong with the way life unfolds, as if everything were a vast stage, and you were merely a character trying to follow a script you never wrote. Things seem solid, people seem real, yet deep down there's a feeling of distance, as if something were watching everything from the outside. This is the first crack in the game, the moment when consciousness begins to doubt its own story. While it believes itself to be the body, the name, the past, it gets lost on the board of forms, trying to win something that doesn't exist. But when it begins to realize that the game is made of the same substance as a dream, something changes. The question is no longer how to win, but who is playing. It's at this point that reality begins to reveal itself, and the illusion, slowly, begins to dissolve. Everything begins in the silence between two thoughts. A brief moment, almost unnoticed, when the automatic flow of the mind loses rhythm, and something within you notices the gap. It's not an extraordinary experience, but a simple glimpse, the knowing that you are conscious. This point of clarity seems small, but it is the beginning of something greater. It is there that the observer begins to emerge. Until that moment, life was lived inside a story. Emotions, fears, opinions, and roles mixed together until they formed a single inner voice, the voice of I. It reacted, planned, remembered, tried to control. Everything that happened was translated in terms of this identity, but suddenly, something observes that voice and recognizes it as noise. The thought that said, I am this, becomes object, not subject. What observes remains silent, untouched. This is the first crack in the mirror of illusion. The game that once seemed absolute begins to show its edges. You notice that thought comes and goes, that emotion arises and dissolves, that the body changes, but something within you remains the same. Alert, lucid, unmoving beneath all forms. This something cannot be seen, yet it is what allows seeing. It is the observer awakening from within the character. The birth of the observer does not bring immediate comfort. It destabilizes because it dismantles the certainty of who you thought you were. The role that once seemed solid begins to feel like a fragile disguise, held together by mental repetition. Consciousness realizes it has spent an entire life identified with masks. The child, the parent, the professional, the spiritual seeker. Useful masks, perhaps necessary, but none of them true. And in that moment, a strange feeling arises. You are alive, but no longer know who you are. This initial confusion is the first sign of lucidity. The mind tries to turn this discovery into a concept, tries to capture the observer as yet another idea. I am consciousness. I am the being observing. But the observer is not a new role. It does not belong to time, has no name, needs no defense. It is the silent space that sustains all that changes. When this presence becomes more stable, the perception of life transforms. Events continue, but they no longer bind in the same way. Physical pain is felt, but it does not dominate. Fear arises, but it does not become truth. You see everything that once carried you away, and that seeing changes the quality of experience. Suffering may still exist, but now it is perceived within a clarity that transcends it. Pain no longer defines being. This new gaze is not achieved through technique, nor maintained through effort. It simply reveals itself when the noise of identification weakens. The observer is the original nature of consciousness, what has always been there before any name. It is the state prior to mind, the point of stillness that observes movement without becoming it. At first, it seems the observer comes and goes, but it's the opposite. What comes and goes are the moments when you forget it. With time, the gaze deepens. Ordinary life, traffic, work, conversations, becomes part of the field of observation. Nothing needs to be excluded. Consciousness does not reject form, it includes it. The observer realizes that the game does not need to end to be seen as a game. It simply loses the power to deceive. What once was drama now becomes expression. What once was search now becomes dance. This recognition, however, is not linear. The mind keeps trying to slip in, saying, now I know, now I've awakened. But true lucidity does not announce itself. It merely observes even the impulse to assert itself. Everything is seen. Pride, doubt, the attempt to understand. Nothing is excluded from the field of consciousness, and in that total acceptance, clarity deepens. The observer is neither cold nor distant. It does not withdraw from life. It sees it with greater intimacy. Unlike the character who judges and divides, the observer includes everything within the same field of presence. This gaze does not seek to correct anything, only to recognize the real. And in recognizing, it dissolves. Illusion fades not because it is fought, but because the light of attention passes through it completely. At a certain point, the observer begins to perceive something even subtler. That which observes and that which is observed are not truly separate. The boundary between subject and object begins to dissolve. You look at the world and feel that the world looks back. The tree, the sound, the other, all reflect the same consciousness expressed in infinite forms. It's as if the gaze turned upon itself, recognizing itself in everything it touches. This is the true birth of the observer, the instant when consciousness, once fragmented, begins to remember the whole. It is not enlightenment nor spiritual achievement, but the beginning of a new vision, a vision that does not depend on belief, theory, or technique, because it arises directly from the living experience of being. The observer does not need to understand the mystery. It is the mystery seeing itself. In the silence that follows this perception, the game continues. But something has changed forever. The I still speaks, feels, desires, acts, but it is no longer the center. Now there is space between impulse and response, between event and meaning. Within that space, everything becomes clear, breathable, light. The character remains on stage, but the stage no longer deceives. And the gaze, which once lost itself in the story, begins to remember it has always been what observes. The birth of the observer is not the end of illusion, but the moment it begins to be seen for what it is, a transient reflection in the mirror of being. From here on, consciousness no longer needs to flee from shadow nor seek the light. It simply sees, and in seeing, begins to be free. The game of illusion does not happen outside of us. It is woven in the invisible space of perception, nourished by three forces that shape experience: ego, time, and identity. These elements are not enemies, but instruments of consciousness itself to experience being as something separate. Without them, the game would have no form. With them, being forgets itself. The ego is born from the need for continuity. Consciousness, reflecting itself in a body and a world, creates a line that connects it to the past and projects it into the future. That line gives rise to the feeling of I, a fixed point amid movement, a story that tries to remain. But that point is only an idea, sustained by memory and repetition. Everything the ego does is try to protect that idea from dissolution. It fears disappearing because it lives through identification. With each thought, it reinforces its presence. This is me. This is not me. And thus the game unfolds, a board of opposites, an incessant flow of comparison, defense, and desire. The ego is not evil. It is simply the mechanism that makes the experience of separation possible. But when the gaze forgets it is a temporary role, the character believes itself to be the author, and in that mistake, suffering begins. The ego lives on stories. It creates narratives to justify what it feels, invents reasons for what it fears, fabricates enemies to preserve its form. It needs contrast. It needs the other to define itself. Without conflict, it does not know how to exist. Drama is the food of illusion. Yet if ego is the main actor, time is the stage on which it moves. Time gives structure to the game. Without it, there would be no beginning, middle, or end. Everything would seem too simultaneous to be lived as a story. The mind then divides infinity into parts, turning the now into sequence. The past gains the weight of cause, the future, the allure of promise. Between them, the illusion of choice, guilt, and haste. But time, seen closely, is only memory. There is no past outside the thought that recalls it, nor future outside the image that anticipates it. Everything that truly exists happens now. Even the act of thinking about time occurs within the present. The problem is not chronological time, but psychological time. The time invented by the mind to sustain the sense of self. I was, I will be, I need to become. These phrases build the subtlest prison there is. While it believes it is moving toward something, consciousness forgets it already is. The illusion of time keeps the game in motion because the character believes there is a prize ahead. Happiness, recognition, awakening. But the future is always the same now, only seen through the filter of hope. And between ego and time arises identity, consciousness's favorite disguise. It dresses itself in names, roles, functions, and stories. Each person, each memory, each title becomes a layer of definition. Identity says, I am this, and immediately creates the other. Everything outside these boundaries is perceived as a threat or something to be conquered. But identity is only the surface of experience, a collection of memories organized to give coherence to the character. It has no substance of its own. If all memories were taken away, what would remain would not be emptiness. It would be the real. These three forces, ego, time, and identity, do not act separately. They intertwine like threads of the same web. Ego needs time to tell its story, and identity is the concrete form it takes within that narrative. Together, they sustain the illusion of continuity, the movement of seeking and defending that upholds the game. But what binds them is forgetfulness. Consciousness forgets that it is the space where the game happens and begins to believe it is merely a piece within it. Seeing this is not easy, because the mind fears the void that would come from losing these references. It has been trained to see itself as a fixed point, and anything that makes it doubt that stability generates anxiety. That's why illusion is seductive. It offers safety, clear roles, defined goals. But that very structure is what imprisons. The promise of stability is the mechanism that keeps the game spinning. The ego wants to find itself, but what sustains it is precisely the movement of searching. It survives in the distance between what is and what it imagines itself to be. The observer, upon awakening, begins to see these mechanisms. It perceives that every emotion is an attempt by the ego to reaffirm itself. Every fear points to something it tries to protect. Every desire to something it believes is missing. But the more the observer sees, the less power these forces have. The simple act of observing dissolves part of the illusion because it reveals that none of it is personal. The ego is not yours. It is a collective pattern, a mode of human mind functioning. Time is not absolute linearity, but a way of perception. Identity is not essence, but convention. All of this belongs to the game, not to what observes it. Seeing the game does not destroy it immediately. Ego still speaks, time still passes, identity still presents itself. But something changes. The emotional bond with these forms begins to loosen. You see them as one watching a dream, involved, yet awake. There is still movement, but the center no longer moves with it. What once was prison begins to reveal itself as expression. Consciousness understands it, created the game not by mistake, but out of curiosity. It wanted to see itself through limitation, to experience contrast in order to remember the whole. Illusion then ceases to be an enemy and becomes a mirror. Ego shows where consciousness is still identified. Time shows attachment to narrative. Identity shows fear of disappearing. Each of these aspects reveals what has not yet been fully seen. The observer matures by looking without judgment, recognizing that even error has a role in awakening. The game continues, but the tone changes. Suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes message. The character may still react, but the gaze that accompanies it knows, none of this is personal, none of this is final. What is real neither is born nor dies. It only recognizes itself through the forms it creates. And it is in this recognition that the game begins to lose its weight. Ego still speaks, but no longer convinces. Time still runs, but no longer rushes. Identity still acts, but the stage no longer deceives. All that remains is the silent presence of the observer, seeing the entire game, and in seeing, beginning to move beyond it. There comes a moment when the gaze can no longer endure its own game. The character still tries to uphold the old story, but something in silence begins to unravel from within. The certainties that once seemed solid, what is right, what is wrong, what is me and what is the other, begin to lose their sharpness. The mind tries to organize this collapse, but no explanation can contain what is happening. The observer has matured to the point of seeing that the game is not only out there, it is the very inner movement of perception. And when this clarity reaches its sharpest point, the rupture occurs. The rupture is not a dramatic event, nor a sudden illumination surrounded by light and ecstasy. It is, most of the time, silent. It happens in an ordinary instant. The gaze fixed on routine, the body in motion, the breath that continues. But suddenly everything becomes different, not because the world has changed, but because something has stopped interpreting. The mind's filter, which once shaped everything into meanings, loses its strength. Thought still arises, but it doesn't stick. Emotion still vibrates, but it doesn't define. What was my life is now simply life, free of labels, free of story. At this point, something profound is revealed. The mind has never seen anything as it truly is. It has always interpreted, categorized, compared. It didn't see the tree, it saw a tree. It didn't see the other, it saw someone with a story. The mind does not live the present, it translates it. And each translation is a layer of distance between consciousness and the real. When the observer goes beyond the mind's filter, that distance disappears. Seeing becomes direct. There is no intermediary, no narrator, no commentary. What exists is pure perception, alive, pulsing, indescribable. This rupture is the end of identification with the content of experience. Suffering loses its basis because there is no longer anyone to own it. Pain may still arise, but there is no longer the I that amplifies it by saying, "This shouldn't be happening to me." The observer sees the movement of life in its totality, without dividing what is desirable from what is undesirable. Everything that once seemed a fragment reveals itself as the expression of a single consciousness in different frequencies. Good and evil, loss and gain, light and shadow, all are part of the same flow of self-knowledge. In this state, control dissolves. The mind tries to keep the reins, but the observer's vision is too broad to be contained. Life begins to move on its own, without the push of personal will. Decisions happen, but they do not come from a calculation. Words arise, but they are not chosen. There is a surrender that is not passivity, and a clarity that is not effort. It is being itself acting through form, without the interference of thought. This moment can cause vertigo. The character feels the ground is slipping away, because all its meaning came from the attempt to control. But as control dissolves, what arises is not chaos. It is the silent order of consciousness in motion, a kind of living intelligence that operates beyond the mind's logic, and that knows without needing to think. Everything that was once fear reveals itself as resistance to this flow. And what was resistance is now surrender. The rupture is not an end, but a return. Consciousness begins to recognize itself in everything it touches. To look at the other is to look at oneself. To breathe is to remember totality. Even what was previously seen as an obstacle now becomes a vehicle. Reality loses the weight of duality, and the game shows itself in its true nature, a movement of continuous self-discovery. After this rupture, something curious happens. You realize that the world remains the same, but the way of being in it has changed completely. Time still flows, tasks still exist, social roles still demand attention, but none of this imprisons. Consciousness observes everything with a new serenity, like someone who sees the ocean knowing it is made of the same water. The waves come and go, but there is no longer fear of drowning. The observer becomes the ocean itself. Even so, the mind tries to return. It says that what happened was just a moment, a mystical distraction. It wants to reclaim the throne. And this is the point at which the observer needs to remain lucid, silent, present. Because the rupture does not need to be defended, it is irreversible. Once the gaze has seen the illusion, it can no longer pretend it hasn't. It may get distracted for a while, but the veil has already been torn. Consciousness, once awakened, never goes completely back to sleep. This perception does not need to be displayed, nor turned into spiritual discourse. It manifests in the simple way of being in the world, in gentler words, in a gaze that does not judge, in a silence that does not weigh. True clarity is light. It does not carry flags. It does not need to prove anything. It sees everything, includes everything, loves everything, not with emotion but with presence. And this presence becomes the new way of living. Perhaps you have felt something like this, an instant of pause where everything seemed suspended, too real to be explained. Perhaps there was a moment when the world lost its contour for a second, and what remained was only pure consciousness, without subject or object. These instants are the cracks of the real, the signs that the observer is crossing the filter. They are not visions, they are not higher experiences, they are reminders of what you have always been. When the veil falls, the game loses its old meaning, but it does not need to end. It only changes its nature. What was once seeking becomes expression. What was once suffering becomes learning. What was once illusion becomes symbol. And everything that exists comes to be recognized as part of the same vibrant field, a field that observes itself eternally. If, upon hearing this, something within you recognizes itself, it is a sign that the rupture has already begun. It does not happen in the future, it happens now. In the instant when consciousness realizes that it is seeing, nothing else is necessary. The rest is silence itself acting. And if this theme touched something in you, if at any moment in your life you felt the gaze cross the veil, that second when everything seemed more real than ever, share it in the comments. Write, "I saw through the game." Let that sentence vibrate in space. It is more than words. It is a silent testimony that the gaze is awakening. And if this message resonated, like the video, so that more consciousnesses remember what they have always been. There comes a moment when the observer and the observed become indistinguishable. The gaze is no longer separate from what it sees. There is no distance between the movement and the perception of the movement. What was once duality, I and life, being and the world, dissolves into a single, silent, indivisible field. The observer is no longer someone inside the game looking at it from the outside. It is the game itself, recognizing itself as consciousness. In this state, vision ceases to be an act. Seeing is no longer something that happens, it is the very mode of being. The gaze does not need to turn toward anything, it is in everything. Consciousness does not observe the world, it is the world observing itself. This is the essence of the final state of the observer. The realization that there is no observer at all, only the pure act of seeing, free of subject and object. The mind tries to understand this, but it cannot. It operates in terms of opposites. It needs contrast to exist. Everything that surpasses duality becomes invisible to it. Therefore, this state cannot be explained, only lived. Language becomes insufficient, concepts lose weight, and silence comes to express more than any word. Silence is not absence, it is full presence. It is the sound of the real vibrating without interruption. As consciousness rests at this point, it discovers that there was never any separation. Experiences that seemed external were only expressions of the same field. Pain, joy, birth, death, all were different forms of the same movement. Nothing was in vain, nothing was loss. Everything served the purpose of revealing what had always been hidden, the unity that sustains the multiple. This recognition is not intellectual. It manifests as a peace so deep that it does not depend on circumstances. Even in the midst of chaos, there is an unmoving center that observes without reacting. This is the presence that does not change, the silent axis around which everything turns. At this point, time dissolves completely. The past reveals itself as memory sustained by the mind, the future as a projection of the same thought. The now ceases to be an instant and becomes an unlimited space. The field where everything happens, the stage of eternity expressed in form. There is no longer anxiety about what is to come, nor nostalgia for what has passed. Life unfolds within eternity, and the observer recognizes it as part of itself. Doing becomes natural, spontaneous, devoid of intention. Everything happens because it needs to happen, without resistance, without effort. The final state of the observer is the point where seeing becomes being. Before the gaze contemplated the world from the outside, there was still the echo of the I that saw. Now the gaze is the very movement of existence. There is no longer the one who observes, there is only observing. And this completely changes the nature of experience. Reality is no longer perceived as something separate. It comes to be felt as the very body of consciousness. Each form, each sound, each gesture is recognized as a manifestation of the same being. In this state, simplicity returns. There is no longer spiritual seeking, nor the need to attain anything. Everything is already complete. The mind's silence is not forced, it is natural. The observer does not try to control thoughts because it understands they are only echoes of the universal movement. Thought arises and disappears within presence, like clouds crossing the sky. But the sky does not change. This is pure consciousness, the space that contains everything without being touched by anything. And then, ordinary life becomes sacred. Drinking a glass of water, walking down the street, feeling the wind, everything takes on the same depth that was once sought in extraordinary experiences. Consciousness realizes that the divine was never elsewhere, but in the very act of existing. Each instant is eternity in motion, and each breath is the universe itself breathing through itself. Simplicity reveals what complexity concealed. The observer, now unified with the observed, realizes that the sacred was always the ordinary seen without the ego's filter. This state is not static. Consciousness continues moving, creating, expressing, yet without losing the lucidity of unity. Human experience remains, but suffering no longer finds where to fasten. The fear of loss disappears because nothing is truly lost. Life is perceived as a continuous flow of birth and dissolution, and the observer recognizes both as faces of the same cycle. Even death ceases to be a threat. It is only a change of form within the field of being. The observer does not seek to escape it because it understands that what is real cannot die. In this state, there is no longer a desire to convince, teach, or prove. Truth becomes too intimate to be turned into an argument. It lives in the way one walks, speaks, touches the world. The observer's gaze carries a serenity that does not impose itself, yet silently transforms the environment around it. Presence becomes a field, a vibration that communicates without words. It is recognizing being in everything that exists. And when the gaze comes fully to rest, something the mind could never imagine arises. Gratitude. Not a gratitude directed at something or someone, but a silent reverence for existence itself. Everything is worthy. Everything is expression. Nothing is wrong, nothing is out of place. Even moments of pain are recognized as necessary movements within the totality. Consciousness realizes there was never a mistake, only learning. The game finally reveals itself as divine play, being's infinite curiosity about itself. The final state of the observer is not the top of a ladder, but the disappearance of the entire ladder. It is not attainment, it is remembrance, it is the return to what was never lost. Being stops seeking the real and recognizes itself as the real, and in this recognition, vision and being become one and the same. To see is to be, and to be is to see. From there, everything is seen as the expression of the same consciousness, the sunrise, the sound of the wind, the pause between two thoughts. The observer rests within what it always sought, not because it found it, but because it realized it never left. The final vision is simple. Nothing needs to be attained. Nothing needs to be changed. What is, already is, and what always was, remains. The game was never a prison, only a mirror. Consciousness needed to lose itself in forms, names, and stories to remember what it has always been, the silent gaze behind everything. When the observer dissolves into what it sees, the game ends, not because life ends, but because the veil falls. The character continues, the world goes on, but the center is at peace. There is no longer anyone seeking nor anything to be attained. The whole of existence reveals itself as a single gesture of being looking at itself. If you have come this far, write in the comments, "The game ended in me." And if this space has accompanied you in this silence, subscribe and continue with us on this path of remembrance and awakening.